in education. To this day, no one knows why they were chosen to write the standards. And why is this important? Because they were writing what would be our national standards, and we are now, in this country, using standards, and I have said this in print before, so it's not new, but we have somehow put people who might be considered imposters, charlatans, mountebanks, people who didn't know anything about standard writing in English language arts, in charge of the standards that are being used in our public schools. There is something peculiar about the situation. No other country would have done this. They would have had prestigious people in charge of anything they were going to do in their Ministry of Education as far as K-12 standards, because I've looked into what a few countries did when they had new objectives for, that most countries have objectives as syllabi. They don't actually have standards. In any event, then there was, as I mentioned, a validation committee formed, which Professor Milgram and I were on. We turned out, committee of less than 30, were the only two content experts on this validation committee, which was charged with making sure that Common Core standards were internationally benchmarked, research-based, and rigorous. I'm sure you've heard the word rigorous millions of times. These standards are rigorous, rigorous, rigorous. Parrots go around talking about how rigorous they are. But no one can define what rigorous means. And as Professor Milgram wrote in his critique, there's no way to get to a STEM major from these standards alone because they are missing crucial topics in math. And as I say, you have to be a mathematician or a high school math teacher, whom you should be able to speak to here, and ask how you're dealing with these missing math standards. In ELA, I couldn't find out about some of the flaws, which I will mention in a few minutes. But the point was that we were two of the 5 people who refused to sign off on these standards. The others did, but Professor Milgram was the only mathematician on that committee. Today we are hearing, well, there were some 7 or 8 other math experts, but these were math educators, K-8 primarily, and he was the only mathematician. So the question is, how did this become a validation committee for standards written by people who are unqualified to write the standards they did? We're not saying that they were academically incompetent. They had their own areas of expertise, but not for standards. So this is a very peculiar situation that this country finds itself in, largely because of race to the top money, which Jamie mentioned. I was on the State Board of Education from 06 to 10. I knew what was happening, and we know, and it's on one of the fact sheets that has been published by Pioneer Institute. You have some fact sheets that you could pick up there, and I don't know if all of these facts are on that fact sheet, but we knew then, back in 9 and 10, that we were going to adopt that State Board of Education, appointed by Governor Patrick, was going to adopt Common Core standards because we were promised $250 million in race to the top money. That was the deal. There were a few other little aspects of the deal, but basically we were going to dump our standards, which produced this kind of phenomenon, for unknown, unproven standards, which you are now living with in your public schools since 2011. They have been gradually implemented so that by now, probably almost all of the school curriculum that you have is based on Common Core standards, unless your teachers have been dragging their heels or your superintendent has been doing other things. But the point is, by now that the tests are beginning, you're probably totally, doing Common Core standards with the curriculum that you have. What are the flaws? Let me go quickly with ELA. With math, I'm not going to say too much because there is a work I have on my homepage, and Professor Milgram makes available his critique of the math standards, which you can read in detail. I have a one-pager that deals with the major flaws in English. And I will just briefly go through the major flaws, starting with the nature of the standards. They're skills, not standards. Now, what do I mean by a skill? A skill is something like find a main idea and supporting details. Why is it a skill? Because you can apply it to anything. Three Little Pigs, Moby Dick. When you find a main idea, that in itself doesn't tell you the level of reading, the historical or cultural knowledge that you want kids to have. And remember, we were trying earlier in Massachusetts to develop a knowledge base. So if you have the kind of standards that are called standards in Common Core, they are basically skills. You can use almost anything for these skills, and that becomes the issue by the high school level. That is the first issue. The second issue is the fact, and this you may know about from your experience, there was a great emphasis put on writing, not reading. I come from a background in teaching of reading and the research on reading. And we know from 100 years of research that good writers have been good readers. Reading precedes writing. If you want to produce good writers, you must at least expose children to the very best prose you can. You can't make them all into good writers, but you can make them much better readers if you have a good sequential reading program. And Common Core stresses writing, not reading, so your children, not only in English language arts and reading, will be doing a lot of writing, they're also expected to do a lot of writing in math, science, other areas of the curriculum. No one would ever say it's unreasonable for a math teacher to ask a child to explain, but as one first grade teacher has said, how much writing can you expect a first grader to do if they're going to explain why they did what they did in a math problem? And is that really how you want class time, instructional time spent? We're not even talking about testing. There are some other issues. This notion that you're going to develop critical thinking by spending all of that time in writing, that isn't where it comes from. What you're losing is the development of analytical reading and writing, which is what your older English teachers used to do. For example, the one that I had at Bridgewater High School, he taught us Shakespeare every year. They taught us how to read between the lines. That was analytical reading, writing, and thinking. And so if you have cut down because of another quirk in Common Core, have more informational text, less literary study, you are cutting down on what the English teacher always did best and well, and that is teach students how to read between the lines of complex literary works. That's what English teachers were trained to do. And if you have informational texts, which are designed to convey information, that isn't what you use for teaching critical thinking. You don't use science textbooks for that purpose. And you wouldn't use a history textbook for that purpose. You would bring together other materials that might contrast different positions, stances, and then have students notice the difference, but that is not what's being talked about in Common Core. In any event, you get some huge problems in your reading English language arts curriculum with Common Core that may escape the notice of outsiders, even school committee members, unless they begin to take a look at the lessons and the assignments. And that is the one thing that has sparked the parent revolt in this country. As parents, who after all tend more than anyone else to look at what their children are doing in school, look at the lessons that have come home when they have come home, they have become more and more upset. So you are now seeing waves of parents, now supported by teacher unions, interestingly enough. Not so much teachers, but teacher unions, because they are freer to speak. Teachers have to be careful because they don't want to be suspended or have their licenses revoked. There's a state policy. That's an issue, I know that. So teachers have to be very careful but their unions can speak up for them, and they are, more and more. New York and New Jersey are two states where the teacher unions have really spoken up. And what are they telling parents to do? Opt your kids out of the tests. This is stunning. We've never had anything like this happen in this country before. But New Jersey and New York, both the unions, large unions, have been saying we want parents to opt their kids out of these tests. You can Google and find all of this available. It's there on the web. So you've got parents who are looking at peculiar things in the math curriculum. I can't go into the details. And people who are looking in private or non-sectarian or sectarian private schools as well as public schools at what their kids are being asked to read and asking questions about, is this what kids should be reading at this grade or in school or at all? They simply are raising questions. And their teachers usually can't answer. And this is one of the things you have to respect. They're being told what to do in many cases. Some school systems have been paying for a so-called Common Core consultant. Back in Arkansas, where I was working for a while, $200,000 a year for the Common Core consultant, who was telling the English teachers what they should be teaching and doing, what kinds of questions they should be asking. In any event, you have teachers who are following directions and want to keep their jobs. Administrators who may be concerned about what will happen when they move on to the next position they may want. So they're supporting what they're hearing from a Department of Education, which often in many states, including this one, cannot cite you any statute that covers what is happening. Parents can opt their kids out. This is something I'm going to move up ahead very quickly to talk about, because it's a parent's right, and parents have had this right for 400 years, whether you were colonies or territories. You can keep your kid at home if they're sick. You can decide you don't want them to go on a particular field trip. You can decide if you don't want your child to take a test that has been mandated by the federal or state government, criterion reference test or standardized test, not a teacher-made test. Those are different. So parents have this right, and there's no statute in any state's body of law that says parents cannot do this. You may have statutes that say you need 95% participation rate for Title I money, and the schools have to offer the test, but it doesn't mean the parent must send the child to take the test. There is a difference between what is in the statute and what many parents are being told. In any event, you have problems with English language arts. The math, as I say, I will not go into detail for. There is Professor Milgram has raised a major question about when the standard algorithms, and these are the procedures that are used in basic arithmetical operations, when they're introduced. According to him, and he deals with students who come from the Pacific Rim universities in Stanford, by grade 8, our students will be about 2 grades behind their competition. That's his estimate, based on knowing what math is taught in Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, other countries in the area, who send students to places like Stanford or for graduate work or other areas, or he's visited these countries. Math, after all, is the same around the world. And Common Core math will have, by grade 8, maybe about 2 years behind. It doesn't require completion of Algebra 1 until grade 9 or early grade 10, which is also a problem. And because there are topics left out that he thinks are crucial, by the time students finish a Common Core math curriculum, based on its standards, they may be several grades behind their peers in other countries. This is what he sees as the critical issue, because engineering colleges everywhere expect students to begin their freshman year with calculus. Usually they have had to take a trig course. but he says the trig standards are mostly not there. So you have to be able, if you don't understand high school math yourself,